A very popular technique, which looks completely different depending on what material you use, is the sumac weave. So I've got a nice piece of roving wool that I'm going to be weaving on left to right direction, and I'm holding the short end of the yarn in my left hand. That left index finger is going to lift the first free warp thread, and I'm going to bring the long tail in my right hand under that warp thread. This is going to go from right to left. Be very mindful that you are not putting it to the top of your index finger, but the yarn is going under the warp thread underneath your index finger. So bring it out to the front and pull the entire tail through. You're just going to tuck the tail to the back of the work, and we can deal with that later. With a thin yarn, you might do the weave around every warp thread, but because we're using a nice thick material, we're going to kind of go on every third warp thread to make a bigger braid that will be formed. So your left hand is holding the piece that's already done one loop, and that left index finger then skips number 1, 2, but lifts the third warp thread, and again bring the long tail underneath that warp thread, and we're going from right to left. Pull the entire tail through back to the front. Now pull the tail a little bit to tighten the stitch, and you'll see the first stitch appearing here. So again, the short end in your left hand, the long tail to the right, and with your left index finger lift up warp thread number 3. Feed the long tail under that warp thread from right to left, below your index finger, and pull the whole tail through. Continue for the rest of the row. To start a new row, we are going to bring the entire tail to the front of the work. So we're going to find the last warp thread we have worked on, and we're going to pull the tail around that and back to the front, pulling it all the way out. This will give you a nice clean edge. As we're now going from right to left, the long tail goes to the left, and the short end of the wool is going to go into the right hand. So we are now going to lift the warp threads with our right index finger. I'm going to do a staggered braid, so I'm going to find one of the warp threads that I haven't braided around on the way over. I'm going to lift that with my right index finger and now bring the tail under that warp thread, but this time obviously from left to right. Pull the entire tail through and tighten gently. From here you're going to continue again with skipping 2 warp threads, 1, 2, lift up the third one with your right index finger and bring the yarn left to right under this warp thread. And now we're going to continue this for the rest of the row. Especially working with this nice thick yarn, we are using this to really bring the bulk and the texture into the work. So don't pull the loops too tight, but make them create some depth in your work. If you're unhappy with the tightness of your strands, you can easily, at the end of a row, go back to just tighten them or loosen them a little bit and adjust them to whatever you're happy with before you continue to the next row. And that's the end of this row and also the end of the yarn. So we're just tuck the tail to the back and you'll see the nice braid, and there continued into a single line of the braid.